I'd like to welcome everyone to this morning's session entitled Resilience, Urban Codes, Policy, Planning and Design. My name is Carie Penabad. I'm the Associate Dean and Director of the Undergraduate Program here at the School of Architecture and founding principal of Carie Penabad Architecture in Miami. And I'm delighted to be moderating this morning's session. Today's presentations are going to focus on a broad range of scales, from policy discussions on a regional or even national level to urban design case studies that illustrate the design implications of both zoning and planning decisions. I'd like to just take a moment to introduce the panelists. The first presentation will be by Katharine Mach, which is Associate Professor of Environmental Science and Policy at the University of Miami. Will be followed by Monica Gregory, who's the Adaptation Programs Coordinator with Miami-Dade County Office of Resilience. We also have with us today Benjamin Northrup, a Senior Designer at DPZ Co-Design. He will be presenting the work of a team, which includes Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, which is Malcolm Matheson Distinguished Professor of Architecture here at the School of Architecture and founding partner of DPZ Co-Design, Galina Tacheva, which is the CNU Fellow and Managing Partner at DPZ Co-Design, Brent Latham, who's the Mayor of the North Bay Village, and Ralph Rosado, who's the Village Manager of North Bay Village. They will be joining us for the Q&A session following the presentations. And finally, we have John Sandell, who is the Associate Professor from Florida Atlantic University. The way we would like to conduct today's session is we will be playing all the videos, one after another, of each of the presentations, and we will keep the Q&A box open and active, and we would like to encourage the participants to submit their questions in the Q&A box throughout the presentations. And when those have been completed, we will address or do our best to address as many of the questions as possible in the final sort of 30 minutes of today's session. So without further ado, we are going to launch the first video by Katharine Mach. I'm not hearing it. Oh.
My name is Katharine Mach, and today I'll be presenting work I've done with my colleague A.R. Siders at the University of Delaware. The title of our presentation is Strategic Managed Climate Retreat for Resilient Adaptation Pathways. The world is changing. Economic development, social norms, and technology are creating momentum towards futures as unlike today as our world is to societies of a century ago. Climate change is one source of this momentum, both constraining the range of possible futures available and affecting the level of transformation that societies will experience. Climate change threatens valued relationships between people and places, the persistence of human settlements in unchanged forms, and even human survivability in some locations. The threats are diverse. They range from sea level rise and flooding, to extreme heat, to shifts in water quality and availability, fire, the list goes on. When we think about these hazards in a changing climate, there's a whole toolkit of options available to us. Broad categories of response for managing risk in a changing climate are often viewed as resistance, accommodation, avoidance, and retreat. Resisting is keeping water out, reducing the probability of hazardous conditions happening in the first place. Accommodation, by contrast, is, for example, making room for the water, reducing sensitivity to hazards. Avoidance, the one we're not particularly good at, is reducing exposure in hazardous locations in the first place. The flip side of avoidance is retreat, moving people and assets out of hazardous locations. If we think of a coastal city, we'll call it anywhere city on planet Earth, Putting these pieces together, what we see is that the world is changing, climate change is altering and constraining the range of possible futures. Adding up the numbers globally, for sea level rise alone, the scope of risk is that between 88 million and 1.4 billion people are at risk of being displaced by sea level rise by 2100. The estimates depending on whether you look just at historic floodplains or low elevation coastal zones more broadly. Up to 1.4 billion people. That is a large exposure. In terms of the economics, it's crucial to recognize that the picture is different depending on whether it's a high population density region or a rural coastline, a high income country, or a low income country. For 13% of the global coastline, keeping water out through resistance has been estimated to be the economically robust option, minimizing the total cost of sea level rise. And by contrast, for 65% of the global coastline, the estimates are that not armoring, allowing retreat to occur, is the economically robust option. So change, response to the changing climate is inevitable, and the real questions are how and why we adapt, how we ensure safety and well-being for people and nature, recognizing that the needs and the potential for adapting to the changing climate, grappling with the risks unfolding, fundamentally depend on our progress in reducing emissions of heat-trapping gases. Just to take a few of these possible futures, they look quite different. You can imagine a quote-unquote hybrid world combining those strategies from above, where in a laser-like fashion, room is created for water, pumping happens, there are retention ponds. The middle world here, called living with, is kind of like a Venice-like world. There's transformation, roadways becoming waterways, for example. The rightmost world could be viewed as a world that's prioritizing agricultural livelihoods, landscapes, densifying where people live, and creating open space as one strategy for managing risks. Even though historically there's a tendency to say, will we resist and armor a coastline, or will we retreat, as if these are either or. The crucial thing to recognize is that for any possible future, or for almost any possible future, it really is a question of how these different strategies are used together, not really an either or. And even though these categories seem discrete, they really are high level. For any one of these, resisting, accommodating, retreating, or avoiding, there are many specific tools in terms of laws and policies as to how societies can move in these directions. Focusing just on the bottom one here, retreat, and its counterpart of avoidance, for example, we see a very large number of legal and regulatory tools. They range from building codes, zoning, incentives to develop in areas or to not develop, mechanisms for preserving low-density areas or ecosystem conservation, how public facilities are treated, recognizing that there can be different legal and policy avenues for public versus private sector property. Then at the bottom, there are some of the categories that are historically viewed as the tools most relevant to retreat, although I will guess, and I will get to later on in the presentation, the way that all of these tools come together will likely be quite different in the future than they have been in the past. So these are the tools, but most importantly, the tools aren't the why, they're just the how. The why is really much more about the priorities people have, what is ultimately important, the goals, the visions for desired futures. And these driving goals and visions are crucial for the way that tools come together in adaptive pathways through time. So as we embark into the future and bring these tools for adaptation along with us, it's crucial to recognize the way that they have emerged from our past histories of land use planning and governance, and also some of the ways that we may do better in terms of strategic, managed adaptation, if we think beyond the constraints of past actions as well. Focusing in now on how retreat has occurred in the past, I think the crucial thing is that for retreat to be something that could possibly be desirable in the future, it will need to differ from how retreat has occurred in the past. There is actually a lot of experience globally with retreat. In one previous study, we looked at how retreat had been deployed as a management intervention to manage natural hazard risk in over 20 countries. Different strategies across these 22 countries in total have moved over 1.3 million people to date. They've ranged a lot. In some cases, residents haven't even initiated the moves themselves. For example, the Room for the River program in the Netherlands in the upper left image here. But it's something where by moving a relatively small number of households and restoring a floodplain, a much larger settlement could be protected. At the opposite end of the spectrum here, in other places, residents have wanted to move, and in particular in requested community relocations, immense questions of environmental justice and climate justice have arisen in the US to date. In the upper right image, we see the way that retreat has mostly occurred in the United States to date through voluntary property buyouts. In a buyout, a homeowner sells their house to the government, usually in the aftermath of disaster, and usually for the pre-disaster value of that home. In terms of experiences to date with buyouts across the US, there's actually quite a lot of experience. Here, looking at a map just illustrating buyouts funded by FEMA over the last few decades in the United States, we see that they've occurred in 49 states in total in over 1,000 counties. And so if we piece together all of these existing experiences with retreat, and then we think about what would be strategic moving towards people's goals in the future in the space of managed retreat, the first key take home is that the future will need to be different from the past. There have been immense questions of equity. What is the process of retreat? Do people feel that it's voluntary? How does it amplify historic wrongs in some cases? Retreat to date has often been incomplete, for example, creating a patchwork of buyouts, not really coherently restoring floodplains in many different locations. It also has often focused myopically on, for example, flooding, independent from the much broader set of priorities that people have. Oftentimes, when the phrase retreat is used, what is actually implied is unmanaged retreat, allowing people to deal with the water themselves, and in many cases be forced to leave a location after a disaster displacement becoming permanent. So sliding that one off the table, putting unmanaged retreat into a separate location, the real question is, what is a role for more strategic managed retreat into the future that strongly contributes to futures people desire? There are many benefits of adaptation actions like retreat, despite of or even because of their complexities. They can be a way of managing risk in the aftermath of disaster and also smaller grade repeat stressors through time. If done well, they can come from within, supporting individuals and communities. And here the process of retreat is crucially important. They also, in creating open space, can strongly interact with ecosystems and the environment and our ability to draw benefits from nature as well. But to get towards these benefits from retreat, it's really essential that many of the epic challenges of adaptation, much more broadly than retreat, be tackled. There's a crucial need for coordination across jurisdictions, levels of government, agencies. Adaptation often requires us to think about the role of climate across many different human activities simultaneously, really drawing to the fore this crucial challenge of coordination. Next, there's the challenge of being more holistic, looking at the multiple hazards changing due to climate change and other stressors simultaneously, integrating this management of climate risk with the full suite of priorities that people have. And finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, there's the emphasis here on being proactive, not just flat on our feet in the aftermath of disaster, figuring out what comes next, but really saying, what does it take to keep everyone safe in a longer term sense, addressing historic challenges as we go as well. To get to the point where retreat could be in service of desired futures, inclusive visions for well-being, The broad categories where we've seen retreat in the past will need to be expanded into the future. Part of this is that very technical tools table I listed earlier, but they come together in broad cross-cutting categories here. Funded is largely how retreat has happened in the US to date. These buyouts where you give someone a check and allow them to move somewhere else, and usually in the aftermath of disaster. As we head into the future, the financial instruments relevant to retreat are deeply relevant much more broadly, even though to date it's been interesting in that for many homes in the US that are repeat flood properties, the cost-benefit comparisons work out strongly, even though this seems like a seemingly radical thing to pay people the pre-disaster value of their home to enable them to leave. The bottom one here, nudged, is more about creating incentives to help support development and relocation to safer areas, recognizing that this is something that we're starting to see being incorporated in terms of long-term adaptation planning. The top two are greater in terms of their requirements for resources, supporting people. When someone moves to a safer location, is there a school system readily available for their kids? Is there a job that's similar to what they were doing in a previous location? Is there the suite of cultural and social supports necessary for people to really thrive? The topmost example here, community relocation, is perhaps the most challenging in our experiences to date, but one where that cultural history is crucially important. There's a history of injustice. There may be real needs to figure out how to do community relocation, even though it has been a place where to date in the United States, we collectively have deeply struggled to support community relocation where it's been requested. So putting all of these pieces together, the question for retreat is, can it be strategic in the future in support of goals that people have? Can it be something that is not just an option of last resort, unmanaged in effect, but something that is more proactive in its movement towards visions for the future? Our basic argument is that keeping retreat in the picture, despite its complexities, can expand the wide range of futures available and move people more readily towards resilience in the long term. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation, and I would be very happy to hear your questions in the Q&A session or at any point. I list my email and our group site here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining my talk today. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. All right, here we go. Hopefully you all can see that okay. So again, thank you for joining. My name is Monica Gregory and I work as a program coordinator in the Office of Resilience at Miami-Dade County. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we are localizing resilience through a planning effort in the Little River Adaptation Action Area. Before I begin, I want to start with a land acknowledgement just to say that many of the lands that we work, play, and live on are the ancestral homes of many Indigenous peoples, including the Seminole, Miccosukee, and Tequesta. And a little bit about our office. Just to give some background, we are an office with 3 teams. We have our mitigation team, our adaptation team, which is the team that I work on, and our communications team. And on the adaptation team, what we really focus on is preparing for climate change impacts, and more specifically, preparing for sea level rise. So recently we released the Miami-Dade County Sea Level Rise Strategy, which is really our umbrella strategy for what I'll be talking about a little bit later in this presentation. We have a main report, which is really the meat of that strategy, and then some mini guides for different audiences that talk about the summary of different impacts to our infrastructure and other systems, the areas or geographies around Miami-Dade County, and then tools and case studies that we can use to adapt to living with more water. But first I want to talk about the Sea Level Rise Strategy and really the meat of what's in that strategy. So we have adaptation approaches, which we've presented to adapt to, again, living with more water on our landscape. We're presenting 5 approaches that can be combined depending on geography, community preferences, and community needs. So those 5 are building like the Keys, are really elevating on pilings, elevating homes, and allowing more water on the landscape for longer periods of time. We have expanding greenways and blueways, which is really making more space for water along canals and waterways, expanding parks, for example. We have building on fill, which is something that we've traditionally done in Miami-Dade County, which includes bringing in soil mined from other areas, putting it down on the landscape and building on top of that soil. we have creating green and blue neighborhoods, which means really making more space for water across the landscape in those smaller spaces, which could include front yards or swales that already exist, or maybe new swales that we can create. And then building on high ground around transit, which focuses on densifying in our least flood-prone areas around transit corridors, like the SMART plan. So these 5 approaches, again, are complementary and can be combined, and some of them work better in different areas across the landscape. So here you can see we have a transect where we've broken down our landscape of Miami-Dade County into different areas. So we have everything from the parks and conservation lands and agriculture to our island and oceanfront and island and bayfront communities. And the water here really runs throughout the entire landscape and connects us from west to east, north to south. This is just another way of looking at it using a map. So here again, we have those different areas, the geographies, which are how we are planning at a higher level to adapt to sea level rise. And within those 5 adaptation approaches, we have what we're calling key tools. So these are tools that are actionable, things that are already existing across the county or are underway in different areas, and things that really make up what those approaches could look like. So think of it as a puzzle, and we put these tools together to create a larger idea, a larger vision, which is that adaptation approach. And here I'm just showing you what those tools pages look like. So we have an entire mini guide that lays out the tools. It's not an exhaustive list, but you'll see things like building artificial reefs and breakwaters. You'll see other things like permeable pavers, like raising seawalls, raising roads. And then again, within that strategy, we have a little bit more on the policy implementation and our key actions and next steps. And the very first action is accelerating adaptation action areas across the county. So that's where we've decided to begin in the Office of Resilience. So let me tell you a little bit about this first adaptation action area that our office is leading. So the purpose of this project is to align the studies and data that already exist in the area, to really collaborate with community members who are living in this smaller area to identify their values, different challenges, and projects and policies they already have in mind that could be implemented to help them adapt to more water. And then developing a forward-looking plan that includes the next steps, potential policy changes, potentially new or existing programs that need additional funding, and then specific on-the-ground projects that need funding for implementation. Here we have a project timeline, just showing you where we are in the process, and we're actually nearing the end of our community engagement and outreach phase. In April, we'll go back to the Florida Department of Environmental Protection with a draft adaptation plan, but we won't stop there. We'll be working in the Little River area through late spring and summer, and well beyond that over the years to come to implement these projects that we've identified. And we have many supporting partners in this effort. So Resilient 305 has an entire collaborative that many people across the county are a part of. But we're also working with the state, with federal partners, with the city of Miami and the village of El Portal, and with some of our nonprofit partners who, we couldn't have done this without them. Here I wanted to show you the Little River Adaptation Action Area study area. So we have 2 pockets of what we call unincorporated Miami-Dade County. And we have an inland area here, which is how we've broken it down for community outreach. We have all of El Portal in that inland area, and we have unincorporated Miami-Dade County and the city of Miami. And then on the coastal side, we have the same, an unincorporated pocket, and then the city of Miami, some of the northern boundary there. And really, when we go to the community, what we're trying to convey is that we have to deal with 2 feet of sea level rise by about 2060. So there are many short-term, medium-term, and long-term challenges, and what we are doing is trying to break up this idea of flooding of sea level rise, which will keep occurring past 2060, but to think about the steps that we can take today, the projects we can fund today, the policies that we can implement to get us that further down the line. And I also wanted to highlight that a lot of this project is focused on coordination and collaboration. So we've been coordinating with our interdepartmental groups, our partners within the county who work with different departments, different divisions, and focus on very different topics like environmental restoration, like water and sewer, emergency management. And so we've been working across those departments, bringing them all together to look at this area of the Little River. And what we've been doing is trying to pull together information from all of our departments at the county, as well as our partners at the village of El Portal and the city of Miami, into a capital improvements map. So we know what is happening on the ground right now across jurisdictions, but also what could be happening in the future where we could be seeking funding and working together instead of just focusing on the county or just focusing like El Portal, only focusing on the city. So trying to do a multi-jurisdictional effort by pulling this information together. And we've been looking at mapping as well. So we're using maps like this to understand our average elevation in the Little River Adaptation Action Area and kind of break that out to help us prioritize what kinds of adaptation approaches, what kinds of tools do we need based on the landscape. So here again, you'll see parts of the city of Miami to the south. You'll see unincorporated Miami-Dade County, which has a lot of flood-prone areas. And you'll see the village of El Portal, which to the south, especially along the Little River, has flood-prone areas too. So we have our coastal pocket experiencing varying degrees of flooding today, and we'll continue experiencing that into the future. And then in the inland area, the same thing, where especially around the Little River, you see some of these dark blue pockets, which is low elevation, and areas that we're already seeing flooding impacts. And so what we've done is we've taken the sea level rise strategy, that transect that I showed earlier, with the different areas laid out across the landscape, and we have identified that in this area of the Little River, we have about 4 different types of landscapes. We have sloughs, which are those low-lying areas that tend to flood the most. We have parks and conservation lands. Some of them are owned by Miami-Dade County. We have mainland bayfront communities, which are those coastal communities right along Biscayne Bay. And we have some pockets of the ridge, which are really, if you're looking at this map, those reddish brownish areas that are the highest pockets that we see. And with our department partners and with our consultants, and Miller Design Studios, we've been pulling together as much data as we can on the area too, to try to understand what is the social vulnerability overlaid with the flood risk profiles. And that can help us decide where to focus the most attention, the most outreach, and what kinds of projects might be the most popular, depending on the community's needs and their preferences. And so we've had a lot of community outreach and a lot of community feedback. And what we've heard so far, really across coastal and inland, there have been a lot of similarities. So flooding damage, drainage issues, we've heard a lot about flooded streets. We've heard about flooded parks as well, failed septic systems. On the coastal side especially, we've heard about overtopped seawalls. We've heard about potentially a pilot berm that could be either exacerbating the problem or needs to be re-examined. And we've also heard about historic designations and no wake signs. And here you'll see just some images that we've captured over the course of the few months we've been working in the Little River area. And here is our partner, the Ocean Conservancy, took a drone out to fly and capture during king tide some of these impacts. Here you can see water on the landscape and it's just hitting the road there. And again here, the water's kind of overtopped the seawall and it's in the road, just lying on the landscape. So really the top 3 things we've been hearing the most from our residents are that the streets and the drainage are a major issue, both on the coastal and the inland side. And there's water reaching the yards and in some cases the buildings of residents who live here. And finally, we've heard a lot about compromised septic systems. So there's been a lot of work done around potentially exploring a connection to sewer. And we've heard a lot of people from both coastal and inland that potentially can't use their homes sometimes because the water table is too high. We've also heard, especially in the inland area, that water has been sitting on the landscape for days and days after rain events. And sometimes it's black water because of those septic systems. So people believe that it could be polluted. There are health hazards, obviously, that go into that, as well as water quality issues. We have noticed through this effort that few people have really been thinking about flooding issues in the long term with sea level rise in mind. So very few people have noted that stormwater can only be really drained down to sea level, and sea level is increasing and will continue to increase. So part of the effort that we've been doing is talking about short-term flooding risks and solutions, but also trying to orient our residents and our community members around longer-term adaptation approaches as they envision what their community could look like under different sea level rise scenarios. We've also heard, though, a lot about opportunities. So we've heard that there could be interest at drainage improvements at different scales, so not just at the local level, but at the state and federal level as well. We've heard that raising seawalls could be of interest. Extending sewers is a major investment. It's something we've heard repeatedly from our residents. There's been some interest in raising the streets and interest specifically in a berm at the end of one of our streets in the coastal pocket. Something that's been really interesting for us is as we work through these community forums with our residents, we're talking about those futures, those adaptation visions, the 5 that I presented in the beginning. And the one that's really struck a chord with most people is the vision of building like the Keys. And this includes elevating buildings. Oftentimes those buildings will be elevated on pilings. There's also another method where you can keep your house footprint as it is now, fill the inside and raise the beams and roof. And that's also been something of interest for many, many residents. It also includes some of these other key tools like elevating critical equipment, increasing living shorelines and green spaces, and then updating our local and state building codes to make this kind of process easier. So we've been showing some of these renderings, specifically pointing towards groundwater, because in a lot of these areas, especially those that are tidally influenced, the groundwater level is the same as sea level. So as it rises, in a lot of cases, this is the reason why we're seeing some of these septic tanks that are being compromised. And so during community forums, we've taken renderings like this, where we show a current situation. This is present day. And then we show what that could look like if we implemented a build like the Keys approach. So we could raise homes, raise critical equipment, and then of course connect to sewer so that septic tank, that drain field wasn't being compromised by higher water levels. And then here we're just showing what it could look like if a flooding event occurred and the homes were raised. This is another view that we've shown. This is another picture from here, from in the adaptation action area, and what it could look like if we increase permeable surfaces, raise homes, connect to sewer, and implement some of those additional things like swales, living shorelines to help capture and filter any stormwater. Then we've also heard about a second approach that a lot of residents have really picked up on and are really interested in expanding. So this one is called Creating Green and Blue Neighborhoods. And this is the one that I mentioned focuses more on creating smaller spaces for water in places like our yards, our parks, and our streets. So here's just one example in a Miami-Dade County park. This is Seawall Park in the inland area of the Adaptation Action Area. And you can see it's a big open green space now, and we've heard from many residents that it floods quite often. And so one thing we've done is kind of envision what it could look like as a stormwater park. Now, this is not something that is moving forward in the county. This is just a rendering taken from some of what the residents have expressed. But again, there are so many different designs that we could do. So for example, if you're looking at this open space and we want to protect it for a soccer field or keep it open for recreation, there are other designs that we could do so that it could still capture and hold some of the water that's running off into the area. So one thing that we have thought about as a next step is doing more of a community design process where we engage the residents who live directly around and are directly using that park in a very targeted way so that we can come up with some conclusion to a stormwater park, not necessarily this one again, but this is just kind of to give people a vision of what it could look like. And then again, this is a street within the Little River Adaptation Action Area. And this is what it could look like if we expanded permeable pavers, if we had more tree plantings, and we had more area to really hold stormwater. One more. Here we have a living shoreline, a water retention area. We've expanded the green spaces, and we've improved swales and reduced some of that paving. So just to bring it back again, this is our project timeline, and we are here at the end of March. Our adaptation plan to the Florida Department of Environmental Protection will be submitted in April, and then we'll continue, especially with community engagement past April, because a lot of what we're doing really relies on a collaboration with the residents that live there. And of course, given COVID-19, most of our outreach has had to be online. So we've had difficulties reaching certain populations, and we're really looking forward to getting back out there and speaking one-on-one with people, having in-person workshops and charrettes, and developing this out even further.
Hi, I'm Ben Northrup. I'm a senior designer at DPZ Co-Design in Miami, Florida. This design presentation is entitled Master Plan with a Focus on Resilience for an Island Village in Biscayne Bay, Florida. I'll be presenting on behalf of my two co-authors. Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk is the lead author, and she's a founding partner of DPZ Co-Design. Galina Tachieva is the managing partner and was the partner in charge on the North Bay Village project. I will go ahead and share my screen. North Bay Village, a municipality in Miami-Dade County, is confronting the large issues of adaptation to climate change with relatively limited resources. In contrast to larger coastal municipalities, typically better resourced for such efforts, North Bay Village has worked within the limits of its annual budget. It has approached resilience issues proactively in conjunction with its cyclical planning effort to update its zoning codes and comprehensive plan. Through a rewriting of the zoning codes, North Bay Village has been able to harness the considerable interest in development to advance resilience planning. North Bay Village enjoys a convenient location and beautiful setting in the middle of Biscayne Bay, reflected in the high real estate values of its waterfront properties. A large stretch of undeveloped waterfront property is eagerly sought after by developers. North Bay Village never considered the option of retreat. That may become unavoidable in the future, but the community is resolved to stay put and has focused on the changes necessary to adapt for the next 25 years. Context and challenges. North Bay Village consists of 3 islands along the Kennedy Causeway. The islands were created mostly in the 1940s through the same process of dredge and fill that was used to create much buildable land throughout the region. Bulkheads, also referred to as seawalls, were first erected in open water. The shallow bay was dredged and the spoils were deposited within the seawalls. The area of North Bay Village is 525 acres with a current population of just over 8,000 residents. Like much of South Florida, North Bay Village faces many challenges related to sea level rise. In recent years, there has been an increase in sunny day flooding. More pressing than such nuisance flooding is the matter of seawalls. North Bay Village is among the handful of South Florida communities whose perimeter consists entirely of seawalls. They were built to keep the land in, not to keep rising seas out. Most are privately owned and well past their intended service life and need to be replaced. Replacement is an expensive proposition for individual property owners, especially owners of single-family homes. Interestingly, geotechnical investigation has revealed that, unlike much of South Florida, the fill upon which North Bay Village sits is relatively impervious. Planning process. In 2018, North Bay Village elected a new mayor, Brent Latham, a resident of North Bay Village who campaigned on a platform to address climate change issues. Mayor Latham hired a new village manager, Dr. Ralph Rosado, who shares his vision for addressing issues of climate change. The mayor will be available during the live Q&A, as will all 3 authors. In the Climate Change Community Town Hall, property owners expressed a clear desire to address the impacts of climate change, especially sea level rise, more urgently. Citizens formed the Sustainability and Resiliency Task Force, led by resident Denise O'Brien, to advise the North Bay Village Commission. The task force collaborated with a U-Link team at the University of Miami, led by Esper Andiroglu, an engineering professor, focused on the next generation of coastal infrastructure. Village manager Rosado initiated a broader planning effort to address resilience issues. DPZ Co-Design, with its long-standing specialty in the new urbanism, was awarded the contract after an RFP process. A week-long urban design charrette in October 2019 was held in the village offices. Local stakeholders, including residents, business owners, developers, and political leaders, engaged with designers in an intense collaborative process led by managing partner Galina Tachieva. Over the following months, with numerous follow-up workshops and meetings, a vision emerged known as NBV 100. It is organized around 3 themes: livability, resiliency, and prosperity. The final report, published in April 2020, presents the master plan and goes into depth on the recommendations. The full report is available on the North Bay Village website. Several of the recommendations are addressed here. A major focus of NBV 100 was to devise new seawall standards. NBV leadership, including the mayor, expressed a clear desire for the new standards to be more ambitious than the county minimum height standard of 5 feet NGVD. Existing property owners, especially residents of older houses built at grade, expressed concerns about blocking their views and direct access of the water. DPZ compiled a table of existing seawall requirements in the region, focusing on local municipalities. After much discussion, it was proposed to require a minimum height of 7.5 feet NGVD, Furthermore, seawalls must be structured with foundations to accommodate a future height increase up to 10 feet NGVD. EAC Consulting was engaged to write the Seawall Standards. They ratified the proposed standards and provided the necessary engineering documents titled Seawall Design Criteria. If North Bay Village adopts these standards, these will possibly be the tallest South Florida standards. The standards also encourage the use of alternative approaches to seawall construction. Living shorelines using native species such as mangroves are not currently allowed by Miami-Dade County if they project into Biscayne Bay waters. However, in anticipation that these rules may change, pre-approved standards for a living shoreline were provided for use by residents. The design was adjusted to minimize the intrusion into the bay. Also, notes were added about provisions for trimming mangroves for view windows, important to homeowners. The use of alternative materials is encouraged also, including glass fiber polymer reinforced concrete, a material pioneered by Professor Antonio Nanni, University of Miami College of Engineering professor and department chair. Unlike conventional rebar that rusts, especially in the presence of salt water, GFPR does not. It is anticipated to have a much longer lifespan, and it can be manufactured with seawater. Professor Nanni's lab provided design details and specifications that are included in the Seawall Standards. A marine preserve in Biscayne Bay has been proposed in which prototypes of alternative coastal infrastructure may be tested. To facilitate the timely construction of new seawalls, North Bay Village considered a deadline for compliance, similar to Fort Lauderdale. However, this approach was rejected, and now the village is considering a seawall improvement district, whereby seawalls in a given area would be reconstructed at once in a single project designed and administered by the village. This approach can benefit property owners in three ways. One, the seawalls will be designed and constructed to a common standard, enhancing both their strength and appearance. Two, economies of scale will result in lower costs for construction. Three, financing can spread out the cost of the project over a number of years. The village, as a government body, may qualify for lower interest rates. The village can recoup its investment through an assessment spread out over a similar number of years, or a bond issue. Island Walk. North Bay Village has long sought to improve public access to the waterfront. On the north side of Kennedy Causeway, the Island Walk is proposed to combine seawall replacement with a new waterfront walkway to be enabled by a new 18-foot easement for public access. The village is applying for funding that will not only allow for amenities such as walkways, access points, landscaping, and lighting, but also ensure the seawalls will be reconstructed to the new height standard. DPZ considered the complex requirements of the various interests, producing a unified design. Subsequently, Moffat and Nickel produced the Island Walk Design Criteria Package, a document that the village can use to pursue funding sources. Stormwater management was considered broadly, with a wide range of tactics classified as short-term, medium-term, and long-term. In the short term, North Bay Village will complete the affordable and effective tactic of installing backflow preventers on the remainder of its stormwater outfalls. This project, begun in 2017 with plans by Kimley Horn, has already reduced the incidences of sunny day flooding. In the medium term, pipes will be enlarged to increase capacity, rain gardens will be installed to absorb stormwater, and updates to the zoning code will encourage the use of permeable pavers. In the long term, North Bay Village will aspire to raise public infrastructure, including roadways and utilities, or rebuild them to make them submersible. North Bay Village is embarking on a new stormwater master plan. Throughout, recommendations are scaled to the appropriate transect zone designated by the form-based code. The elevated village. In response to the multiple and complicated challenges of sea level rise, DPZ presented an innovative solution called the elevated village, pioneered by Andres Dwani, a DPZ founding partner. The concept proposes that all structures on a given block are eventually rebuilt on top of a structural deck that covers all the lots, producing a unified, elevated pedestrian realm, well above even the worst storm surges. On top of this deck, residents can walk out their front doors onto sidewalks or out their back doors directly into their own backyards without negotiating a lot of steps. This strategy avoids the need for vast amounts of fill, which will be increasingly costly and unavailable as demand surges in coming years. By slightly increasing the allowed density when redevelopment occurs, property owners can recoup the infrastructure investment. Implementation of the elevated village can occur in several ways. Funding can be pursued to implement the project one block or one half block at a time, as illustrated in the top sequence. Alternatively, implementation can be incremental, as illustrated in the bottom sequence. Individual property owners can raise their own lots separately, or adjacent property owners can collaborate in raising their lots concurrently and split the costs. Aggregated lots can be subdivided to increase density and offset the infrastructure costs. The form-based code is an approach to zoning that focuses on built form instead of segregation of uses, fostering the creation of walkable, mixed-use neighborhoods with a range of densities organized according to the transect illustrated here. Among its innovations, the new code proposed to measure building height from benchmarks that can be adjusted as sea levels rise. In commercial districts, illustrated on the right, height will be measured from the base flood elevation plus freeboard. In residential districts on the left, height will be measured from the top of the required understory, which itself is measured from the future crown of road, that is, the anticipated elevation of a street once it is raised. Also proposed was the new residential understory, accommodating a limited amount of parking and storage, but primarily open so that floodwaters may flow through. Inspired by the recent understory ordinance in Miami Beach, the NBV 100 code includes provisions that support an appealing and walkable public realm, which in turn supports property values. Buildings must present visible front doors to thoroughfares. The understory must be finished cleanly, and mechanical systems must be concealed from view. A density bonus program is also part of the code, always conceived as a program to provide public benefits. In early drafts, it was an art and public places program. In subsequent drafts, the village considered directing the benefits toward a resilience trust fund with TDRs to support historic preservation. While the primary focus of NBV 100 is adaptation to climate change, the plan also addresses mitigation, the reduction of carbon emissions. It encourages green technologies, such as solar panels and wind turbines. Alternative modes of transportation, such as bicycles and electric vehicles, are encouraged with the provision of dedicated parking, bicycle lanes, and charging stations. The heat island effect is mitigated by the use of high albedo materials. A marine preserve has been proposed in Biscayne Bay to conserve local flora and fauna and to contribute to carbon sequestration. Conclusion. With the help of the NBV 100 master plan and vision, the village is moving forward on various fronts with its plans for resilience. It recently adopted the form-based code for the Kennedy Boulevard District, intended to spur new development and to bring in much-needed resources for other projects. A form-based code for the North Bay Island District is under review. The seawall design criteria has been reviewed and approved by the pertinent boards and is now before the Village Commission for approval. An experimental section of GFPR seawall has been poured to test the durability of the material. The Island Walk design criteria package has been approved by the Commission. The elevated village proved to be too controversial and was rejected by residents. Nevertheless, it provoked valuable conversations about the future that have enabled the other steps to be taken. Thank you for your attention. And I and several others will be available for questions and answers in that upcoming session.
We have one final presentation, and so we will be posting the video by John Sandell, and then that will be followed by a Q&A session. So please, I encourage you to post your questions, and we will do our best to address as many as possible.
My name is John Sandell, and I'm an associate professor at the School of Architecture at Florida Atlantic University. The title of my presentation is From Region to Neighborhood, Sea Level Rise and Reimagining South Florida Urban Environments. We view sea level rise as a catalyst to rethink the relationship between nature, urbanization, the inevitable transformation of many coastal urban environments, and the reimagining of unique blue-green environments. This project uses an alternative future scenario-based design model in order to study future urban environments in at-risk areas. A scenario-based design model can be defined as a plausible description of future climatic states, which guide the reimagining process and design options. Such projects are ideated with the understanding that they are used as one instrument to be analyzed together with environmental impacts, social equity issues, economic challenges that can guide policy changes in anticipation of future climatic states. For the project scenario presented in this study, the timeline is approximately 100 years. The site studied location is Fort Lauderdale, Broward County, Florida. From east to west, the site stretches from the coastal strand to the I-95 and includes the city's downtown and part of the western suburbs. We consider the major factors of future flooding, including land elevations, the current and future water table levels, as well as the civic and cultural value of the downtown urban core of Fort Lauderdale. The project's purpose is to identify qualities established by a vision of public spaces integrated in a natural habitat, features that will one day dominate the region, a managed retreat, repair of future flooded areas, and the consolidation of human habitat along the Atlantic coastal ridge are the major underlying conditions for the project. 3 focus areas are sketched for increasing urban adaptive capacity. 1, defining the city as an urban commons. 2, pedestrian communities connected by urban waterways and multimodal transport systems. And 3, placemaking through the legibility of building morphology, flexible use landscape spaces, and social environments. Today, I present an overview of the project with a focus on the notion of an urban commons made up of built and natural habitat and some policy mechanisms that can be considered in order to achieve resilient environments. The project conceptually adopts adaptive strategies recalibrating design to facilitate a more adapted urban environment. Adaptation moves away from developing in at-risk areas, such as low coastal and inland areas, and therefore hypothesizes floodable environments along with strategic relocation. Adaptation, also referred to as protection measures, conceptualizes the use of some structurally hard interventions, such as floodproofing by raising streets and existing structures onto plinths. And adaptation strategies also entails soft interventions, including natural buffering, flood basins, bioswales, and pervious surfaces in order to absorb the impacts of tide, storm, surge, and rain. Yet we further the adaptive hypothesis, both anticipatory avoidance of vulnerable properties and transformative strategies. Transformative strategies include strategic relocation and working with the effects of climate change rather than trying to manage, avoid, or dominate them. Such strategies advocate an urban design approach that embraces a dynamic situation imposed by nature, seasons, cycles, sea level rise, and extreme events, and refer to concepts of resilience, source efficiency, and quality of life as a means of incorporating multifaceted functions into built environments. Land, and in particular urban environments, defines the city as a commons, a place that is jointly shared. As Topolovic states, land is always a cultural, social, and therefore political product. The goal is to make a city and the makeup of a city economically, environmentally, and socially advantageous toward the common good. Such actions encourage land law reform and a coordinated effort of governance of land at the local, state, and federal levels. The preservation of natural habitat, for example, is a long-term good for the health of the planet, and in the context of this project establishes the most apparent project quality, a regional commons of water and land environs with the goal of clearing and repairing low-lying land to natural habitats while increasing housing and commercial density on higher elevations. Within the built areas, the development of flexible spaces at the ground plane could render the city more agile to climate impacts. Islets are conceived as pedestrian communities. Gardens, canals, bioswales, tree islands, and shoreline mangroves infiltrate within islets. The interchange among networks and public space is fluid rather than static, allowing for change in use and intensity. Flexible use landscape spaces with the range of functions amplify the importance of such interchanges. For example, urban green areas can benefit the health of the ecosystem when designed to accommodate changing flood levels with natural habitat, gray water filtration in park settings. Such functions need not be isolated. Instead, they can be scarily connected to larger hydrological units that allow the system to adapt to changing currents and tide levels. Benedict and McMahon emphasize connections between parks, preserves, riparian areas, wetlands, and other green open spaces as critical to properly functioning natural systems. The connections extend to fluvial and surface water, flooding and storm surges, flow paths and tides from the permeability of surfaces to tidal impacts along a coastline. As such, these hydrological units can form integrated networks that can be read as a cohesive part of the architecture of the city and help maintain healthy diversity of plant and wildlife within an ecosystem. As ground space transitions to an urban commons, criteria governing future built fabric could evolve in response to climatic factors. Building orientation and typologies could be designed to respond to seasonal changes, air and light, using passive means in order to increase human comfort of public and private spaces while respecting natural habitat. A flexible yet compact built pattern can perform to prevailing breezes and augment the integration of public space at the ground plane. The integration highlights a porous urban fabric where the elements of urban space, path, street, court, arcade, terrace, porch, and square could blend and overlap. The strategy accounts for site as layered and interconnected. It treats natural habitat and open spaces, infrastructure and buildings as distinctive and contrasting, yet with the intention of allowing for continuous adjustment. The reconfiguring process foregrounds nature's role in the ideation of changing conditions. These are illustrated by the stilted housing on the intercoastal, the build morphology within the archipelago, and the transformation of the I-95 into livable communities. Each zone suggests land divisions that deviate from the grid. Rather than shuttered and private, an open and agile building pattern, water system, and economic landscape dominate the ground plane. Policy instruments aimed toward building resiliency and sustainability practices must be considered from the scale of the region to the neighborhood and block. The FSU College of Law document Emerging Legal and Institutional Responses to Sea Level Rise in Florida and Beyond, protection, accommodation, strategic relocation, avoidance, and procedural recommendations are detailed. The document's policy instruments include the transition of vulnerable land from private to public ownership, transfer of development rights, purchase of development rights, and rolling easements. The document further recommends that new development is directed away from vulnerable lands to safer areas and include instruments such as land conservation, conservation easements, and coastal setbacks. The Urban Land Institute Resilience Panel Focus Group explores issues of the transfer of development rights as part of a climate adaptation strategy for flood-prone areas while supporting inclusionary zoning priorities in communities. Yet in order to limit the use of large-scale expropriation in the short term and competitively control the qualitative features of any development, a wider range of instruments must be implemented and experimented with as part of a comprehensive approach to building resiliency into city environments. Rupert argues that the development of community land trusts for land acquisitions, restoration and conservation projects, as well as the preservation and restoration of land to natural habitat, affordable housing, housing security, and wealth building opportunities need to be integral and considered part of a shared equity model. Malloy emphasizes wetlands conservation, and this element will most certainly expand by 2070 and must include permanent retreat and relocation plans coordinated with a substantial repair of natural habitat and wetlands conservation programs. Other instruments could also be utilized in support of a shared and resilient commons. These range from the right of preemption, expropriations, and public-private long-term leases to cooperatives, concept tendering procedures, non-commercial foundations, tenement syndicates, social environment protection areas, and urban development contracts and measures. Concept tendering procedures, for example, grant communities the right to lease or sell property according to the best suited concept for the realization of predetermined goals based on a set of criteria: architecture, urban design, life cycling principles, energy conservation, preservation of natural environment, and so on. Tenement syndicates grant the purchase of real estate for the purpose of turning it into public property, creating affordable housing in the long term and initiatives oriented toward the public good. The above qualitatively impact the redevelopment of neighborhoods. They can address social inequities, public places, parks, and the legibility of place specific to South Florida ecosystems. The array of instruments must be broad, measures that may be considered on the offense and not just defensive or reactionary. The Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact, Broward County's priority planning areas for sea level rise in the county's 2020 land use plan, and Fort Lauderdale's climate change element of the comprehensive plan all consider land use, including areas of potential population growth, natural systems restoration, and infrastructure adaptation, and as stated, long-term functionality of a pertinent infrastructure, especially water management, drainage, water supply, and water treatment systems, both coastal and inland. Furthermore, they recommend the integration of green infrastructure and natural systems in urban environments as part of the resiliency strategy. Among the elements, South Florida cities and counties continue to identify, analyze, and map the complex intersections among the numerous areas in the built human and natural domains, from zoning and density to economic impacts and social equity. To achieve an urban commons, land rezoning will need to evolve based on time-oriented projections of sea level rise, intervals of time over activity. Time-oriented assessment and policy implementation work hand in hand with community-managed rezoning of flexible use spaces and their incorporation of incremental changes into adaptation action areas, including a hierarchy of vulnerable areas at the scale of region and neighborhood. These intervals can then be associated with the policy mechanisms most appropriate to a long-term transformative process. It begins in part with, one, a more aggressive public awareness program about future transformations in the city and its potential impacts. Two, the mapping of current and the feasibility of future public land acquisitions as part of a long-term conservation and habitat repair program. Three, time-oriented economic impacts, and especially on the most vulnerable communities. And at the scale of buildings, 4, the life cycling of past building stock and current redevelopment plans. And 5, more aggressive energy saving standards for new and existing buildings of all scales. The challenges are numerous and range from the availability of potable water to the consolidation of built fabric and the transfer of people from vulnerable neighborhoods to new housing while minimizing disturbances and keeping communities intact. The integration of resiliency measures with a transformative built morphology aims to understand the city as commons and the legibility of such that defines place through the creation of unique public environments. Part of the program addresses human comfort, accessibility to services, and the present aims to drastically reduce emissions and overall energy use for Fort Lauderdale's reconceived blue-green networks. By working from the scenarios in reverse, policy instruments could be increased to include multiple kinds of public-private economic incentives aimed toward a radical democratization of public space that supports social and environmental resiliency and justice. A major goal at the grassroots level would be to achieve a shift in public perception, a public consciousness of their city as a shared commons. Just as procedural strategies generating public awareness through community outreach are critical to policy reform, multiple time-oriented project-based design scenarios conceived in tandem with a broad array of policy instruments can play a critical role in mapping out future trajectories and assisting anticipatory governance frameworks for the transformative growth and development of South Florida cities. Thank you.
I'd like to thank, first and foremost, all the presenters. I think that you've given us a great deal to think about, and I apologize, John, for the blurry captions. That was not John's fault. It was a technical glitch. We did our best to try to get it up again, but you know, we're going to keep moving forward. I think the graphics were seductive enough that even if the text was a little blurry, we were okay. So I see that there's a number of questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to try to address a number of these. There's a question by Diva Taylor, which I think could apply to a number of the presentations. I think at the heart of it is the relationship between individual site strategies or building strategies and how these interface with larger infrastructural challenges. So her question is, if the homes are eventually raised, like building like the Keys, I guess, won't the flooded streets or the sidewalks still present a mobility or accessibility issue? And how will we deal with that? So I don't know who might like to take a first stab at that question.
Benjamin, would you like to go first? I have some broader thoughts, but I suspect you have thought about this very specifically from a design angle.
Sure, just to say a few things. Yes, the floodwaters will present an issue on streets and sidewalks, but the floodwaters will recede, at least in the near term. And the important thing is that structures are built high enough that basically the key is that interior finishes aren't compromised. That's what really causes a tremendous amount of damage, so the structures can be used once the floodwaters recede. And then, of course, long term, you can also raise public infrastructure. I think the important thing is to be able to facilitate both, to allow private development to sort of be raised and public. And those may not always happen at the same time, but zoning can help allow it to happen in the private even before the public is raised.
Perfect. And I can just give a few other things that come to mind. Thank you, Diva, for listening. It's a wonderful question. And I think as Benjamin described, key point here is there are different ways to achieve elevation, right? So a home on stilts will allow water to still come under it, presenting mobility issues that are more about, can you get in and out of the house if you have a mobility issue, if you're elderly? What about in a disaster if you've installed an elevator that no longer works? Different from the fill mode of elevation, where the question then becomes, where does the water go as well? And I think what's been really neat is to see, for example, increased attention from FEMA. Funds for pre-disaster mitigation totally can involve things like elevation, but then this also interactive question of, what do you do if a resident needs an elevator now? How do you finance that? And what do you do to get them out safely if the power is out? And I think the wonderful example there of those interconnections that Benjamin described is that this really points the importance of taking a system-wide perspective. So if you do some elevation of roads and now you've created a ground floor that's basement and doesn't qualify for insurance, that's one level of system interaction. But then you've also got the fact that some of the infrastructure is going to be federally managed, some state managed, some locally managed, some private, and getting all of that to happen in sync is really, really crucial to these questions of accessibility, mobility, equity, and the full system functioning as a whole.
Is there anyone else that would like to weigh in on that question? Okay.
Yeah, I could just quickly say too, I mean, one thing that whenever we're doing a lot of our like one-on-one conversations with residents, or when we're doing workshops, just speaking with people who are living in these communities, we try to convey that it's going to be an ongoing issue. So there are some short-term things that we can do at the county, some short-term things that the cities can do. But just like Katharine is saying, I mean, it's going to be a multi-jurisdictional approach, and it's going to be at all levels. And some of these things do take longer than others. So for example, if you're talking about septic to sewer conversion, if you're talking about, raising all the roads in a certain neighborhood, some of those things can take much longer than, 2 to 3 years. It could take decades. So it's something that we talk about, we're in it for the long haul, and this is going to be a phased approach, and we need to be ready for whenever these implementation funds become available. So actually creating and crafting this vision together in collaboration with our communities is really the first step. But of course, the implementation will be phased, and it will probably be over, even past my lifetime.
And let's remember that we can look to Miami Beach for having given us some examples that we can be learning from, because the experience is very important. What works, what doesn't, what has to be changed over time. And so a little bit of that exists already in Purdy Avenue.
If I could add one more thing, there really are sort of a number of moving pieces with regard to North Bay Village and certainly many of your other coastal communities. So one of the things we're doing right away that's long overdue that we haven't done in the past is we're undertaking preparation of a stormwater master plan to really sort of coordinate these various sort of competing potential projects on both private property and public property. Over the years, the village, and I'm sure this is the case for many local governments, we've made considerable investments in infrastructure, but they're not necessarily thought of in a more sort of cohesive and comprehensive manner. And so this is aimed to get us for a strategy that I think is going to reflect that we probably need to invest quite a bit more in infrastructure and probably ultimately go out to voters to support some investments that are expensive, but very tactically intelligent and strategic for a number of decades to come. So I think that's probably maybe one of the first steps that all communities should think of is, if you're going to look far toward the future, it's figuring out how all the different infrastructure projects come into play and can support each other.
So we had a few questions that came in for you, Monica, regarding the Little River project, but I think some of them are interrelated, so I'm going to try to combine. The first one had to do with essentially what financial vehicles are being considered to be able to develop the plans that you just proposed. And then I think a question that I think can be paired with that is, you mentioned quite a bit about the septic tanks failing. And so is there any data about the monetary damage that that's causing? Because that information would be useful in justifying conversions of the sewer systems from a funding perspective. So.
Yeah, to start with that first question. So there are a variety of projects and even county-wide policies that can be scaled to the Little River area. And with a variety of projects specifically, so if we're looking at projects that are unfunded, so things that have been created in collaboration with community members maybe, or things that the departments that we work with at the county have been considering, but would like to move forward with specifically in the Little River area, because, it can range from things like, expanding a park to create a stormwater element, or it can range from, exploring new opportunities, new innovations in septic systems. So if we can't convert to the sewer system in this area, if that's not something we can do in the near future, what other innovations can we explore? How can we fund them? And funding can come anywhere from the federal government. It can come from the state government, from state appropriations. It can come in the form of our own budgetary process, depending on the project. So for stormwater expansion, for example, if we're looking at a park, our parks department can put that into their budget as an item. But if it's a larger scale project, like say, if it's public infrastructure and it's something that we need to raise, like critical equipment, that's usually a longer process and a much more expensive process. So that would be funding that we have to look at from a variety of funding to source from a variety of sources. So usually it'll be federal government, it'll be phased over time. So it really depends on the project and the scale of the project. And again, it's going to be something that takes time because we're looking in this area more holistically. So, again, not just at like, how can we do stormwater parks? That could be something that's a little more short term, but over the long term, how do we transition this area? And, anything from like, how do we look at affordable housing? What do the community members want with affordable housing, to how can we improve drainage in the short term while also simultaneously thinking, 40, 60, 100 years from now, what will that look like in the long term when we can no longer drain the water off the landscape? And then for the septic system specifically, we do have stories from residents about how much money they've paid, like losses over time. So if they can't use their home for a certain amount of time, or if, for example, they have to get their septic tank pumped, we know about how much that has cost some residents. Also, our water and sewer department does a lot of work on septic systems. And so they may have cost estimates already that they're using to do a cost benefit analysis, but it kind of just depends on what you're thinking of. If it's like a residence, the cost to them because they can't use their home anymore. If you're just looking at maybe water quality impacts, how we're going to cost those out. But on hand, our office doesn't have like a full suite of cost estimates that relate to all of those things, but water and sewer department may have better estimates of the costs of residents not being able to use homes, water quality impacts, and then also of actually connecting to a sewer system in a place where there are laterals where they can actually connect, or maybe even the cost of a mounded system in places where we don't have those laterals right now.
So
could I highlight two generalizable themes? Is that okay, Carie, or do you want to jump to the next one?
Oh no, go ahead.
Yeah, just two things came to mind as Monica was giving that very thorough answer. And just to pick up her last point on these challenges of knowing how costly climate change is at present and how costly responses are, I think an important generalizable point there is the degree to which as climate change impacts are increasingly occurring, the cascades are really problematic in terms of amplifying the total impacts and the fact that we historically haven't looked at them. So if it's now a septic system issue that causes or exacerbates water quality issues region-wide and leads to fish kills, suddenly the economic impacts, whether it's septic systems or wildfire smoke in the American West, what we're seeing again and again is that the lived experiences are carrying much higher costs than those that we as scientists initially developed in terms of very siloed approaches within a given sector. And also then on the flip side, thinking about what is the cost of response and the feasibility of response, a very differentiated view of people in society is absolutely crucial, because if you own a $20 million house, converting from septic to sewer is going to be no problem. If you're a low-income homeowner, it's vastly expensive. And that type of landscape is absolutely crucial to public policy strategy, as we've seen so profoundly from the MDC Office of Resilience. And then the last point on the broader theme of finance, I would just say also how we think about finance, such big innovation is needed. And it's not just $1 million question, not just $1 billion question. Frankly, globally, it's way over $1 trillion question. And our questions around innovating our financial instruments deeply interlink with how we are transferring and managing risk. So insurance, catastrophe bonds, and then the institutional constraints that are very much designed for a climate that is not changing, yet we're in a climate that is changing. And so we're seeing, whether it's hurricanes in the southeast or fires again in the west, where budgets that were available for proactive mitigation activities are getting blazed through in the emergency management phase increasingly. And so thinking about these interconnections between risk management, transfer, institutions, disaster cycles, financial instruments really come into profound focus when we ask this question of how are we going to pay for it?
Yeah, I think your comment underscores the difference between being proactive versus reactionary. And when sometimes the threats seem to be so far in the distance, it's hard to prioritize. But in fact, I think that the comprehensive view is a critical one. So thank you. We're going to take another question. There's a question from Aida Curtis and on the topic of retreat. And she's curious as to whether retreat has been discussed with the residents of either the Little River Action Area or the North Bay Village. So.
Yeah, I can start and then I'll pass it over to Ralph. So in the Little River Adaptation Action Area, we have presented all 5 of those approaches. I know I went through them pretty quickly because honestly, I could talk about it for hours. But one of them does have voluntary home buyouts as a tool because that is the language that we are used to talking about and using with residents. It's actually not something that we found that most residents know or have thought about. But on some of our community forums, we did hear that many residents have considered moving because of these flood risks. Now, when we went to actually talk about those 5 approaches, the approach of the tool of moving away was not the most popular tool. I think probably it's interconnected with the fact that people are still thinking about this idea as a short-term problem and a drainage problem. So typically we hear that people want the drainage infrastructure to be fixed, and they think that if that is fixed, it will be something like that's really the path forward to these kind of short-term drainage issues. The longer-term view is something that we're still having conversations about all the time, not just in Little River, but across the county. So I think that does make a big difference in how people are viewing this and in what time frame and how seriously they think about sea level rise as a permanent and really something that's already happening. So a lot of what we're working on is education and communication about some of those basics. And then managed retreat itself is not a term that most people are familiar with here. So if we were in a community workshop and we said managed retreat, that's not something that people would already connect with moving away or, accepting a home buyout or entering one of those programs. And I'll pass it over to Ralph in case you all have talked about that a little bit as well.
Thank you, Monica. We actually have not been discussing managed retreat. I mean, it's something that could come up, but so far, no, we're not going down that pathway. It doesn't look like.
I think one consideration in these contexts is just a place like North Bay Village with a very privileged location in the middle of Biscayne Bay, just sort of this context of prosperity and the strong desire for development. Retreat is not really, doesn't seem to be on their radar screen and was not seriously considered.
Yes, during our charrette, I remember that we discussed it very briefly. We put it on the table kind of the first day maybe of the charrette, and the residents, the community was very clear that retreat is not an option at that point. So we will be looking that during our public process, our goals were to discuss how to manage the future growth and not how to retreat. For now, at least for the next generation.
Also, the time frame for the study was 25 years.
We have a question, which I think certainly the Ben and the North Bay project or North Village project could address, but also I think maybe a question that John might be able to weigh in as well. This question comes from Mariana Boldu. And it says that she has seen proposed living shorelines seaward of seawalls, which is not currently possible because of several layers of multi-agency regulations that are not about to change anytime soon. So have living shorelines landward of seawalls? Are these being considered? I don't know.
You want me to address that?
Yes.
Ben, why don't you start?
Yeah, a place like North Bay Village, the properties are relatively small, and of course, when you do a living shoreline, it's sloped and sort of eats into a lot of the property. So there wouldn't be probably a tremendous amount of interest in existing property owners to sacrifice so much land to the living shoreline, even if they like the idea. So what we did include a design, a specific design in the design criteria, in the design Seawall Standards. You're allowed to put riprap out to 8 feet. So we sort of extended it out 8 feet and then made it as steep as we could and sort of cut into the land as little as possible. That's at least possible. It does seem like living shorelines are more permitted up in Palm Beach County. And so our sort of hope is that maybe eventually they'll be permitted. And by including this detail in the package, it'll get people thinking about that as a possibility. And then another thing that we worked hard to include was just language just pointing out that you can trim mangroves to preserve views. It feels like it's one of those issues that seems very kind of trivial and decorative to engineers, but for homeowners, it's really a critical consideration. But you must reserve that right before planting new mangroves. So we made sure to include that language in the Seawall Standards.
Yeah,
and we recently, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Ralph, go.
Sure. I was going to say, we recently adopted our Seawall Standards just in the past few weeks. But one of the things that we built in there is that we do allow residents to, and property owners in general, to have a range of materials. So living shorelines is one of the options, but we have a variety of other ones as well. We want to give folks a little bit of flexibility.
Yeah, I would just add, because this is obviously with my project, it's a much longer term visioning project that's really looking at sort of scenario based and then working backwards. But that said, I think there's going to come a point, and I presented this very briefly in my presentation, where living shorelines, artificial coastal reefs, retention and retention-based ponds, of course, have been mentioned already in a number of the other presentations. Any kind of riparian buffering is going to be absolutely critical. And I think in a lot of neighborhoods, people are going to, land is going to have to be expropriated. That would, of course, be an extreme. Or again, there's the cities and counties and whatnot, the different agencies are going to have to buy these areas of land that can be rethought with soft buffering measures, so that it protects the community as a whole. I don't see, again, any way around that. So it's a question of time, and so I'm really looking, of course, and I'll stop my answer there, but I'm really looking at sort of these long-term things so that we can work backwards, really, in transdisciplinary teams, as some of my colleagues are already doing. I'll leave my answer at that. So.
Liz, for you, John, had asked if you would be willing, and I think that maybe this is something that you could post, but to provide the references for some of the documents that you were referring to in your presentation. Lori.
Yeah. I can do it for her. I can email her, of course. But I mentioned most of the references already. A lot of them are coming from our city and county documents which exist, and of course the regional climate compact folks. So there's nothing new there, and I think some of the other references I already mentioned in my presentation, and they will be, of course, published as well. So, and a lot of the ones I think what Liz might be referring to, some of the ones I mentioned just on the chart, they're coming from different journals from Europe primarily. So some of them are sort of structured where and we're all, I think, familiar with cooperatives and so forth, but a lot of them are structured so that they work in different kinds of environments where there's been a longer history of it's sort of the notion of urban commons, and I think that's where the focus really was on this particular presentation, not on other aspects of the project. So any kind of social environmental protection areas could be one way to think about it. Different kinds of urban development contracts with always involve public and private entities. So I think the downside of some of these, I think, instruments in the long term or well, especially in the short term, but possibly even in the long term, is when do you bring, I think one of the big questions that I've arrived to is when do you bring all the stakeholders sort of into the picture? And I know I'm mentioning this because I think all the other presentations, up front brought the communities into the dialogue at the beginning. And I think that's great. I don't want to, mislead anybody by my comments. But I also think that when we're looking at sort of longer term ramifications of sea level rise and so forth and environmental changes in the area, we have to put ourselves together in obviously these multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary teams where we're working in a much more sort of cohesive manner. And I better stop. I think I
sorry to interrupt you because we'll all be disconnected because we're all connected through the Zoom link. So I don't want everybody to hear without thanking.
I'll stop there.
And thanking Andrea Lira, who was the producer for this and doing a lot of work backstage. I would encourage you to look at the chat. There's a link to the next keynote address where Paul Farmer will be speaking with Felicia Knoll. And I would encourage you, if you have an opportunity to have lunch while you look at that, I think that would be a great thing. Also, we could take one last final quick question. I just want you to understand that we could just lose everyone in the middle of the question. So I didn't want to just start and have everyone disappear. But there was one last question about how we can incentivize retreat. I know, Katharine, you spoke quite a bit about this. So maybe if you could say this in less than a minute, what can we do to incentivize retreat?
Okay, it's good I've got a time limit because I could go on about this one for a long time. I mean, I think in a way, maybe a first starting point would be quite along the lines of what Monica said, that there are different ways to think about avoiding or removing development from hazardous places. Some of those will mean that it never happens, and others actually are much more about saying it's not a last resort, it is not failure of adaptation, it can actually be a good thing. So in the space of incentivizing retreat, I think looking at places like the Netherlands, where you talk with Dutch colleagues in water risk management and they say, we don't retreat. And then they say, actually, we do. We just don't call it retreat. So I think that's a really profound entry point, and one where we're trying to do a lot of research across communities in the United States, saying who's avoided development in hazardous places in the first place, who's retreating, and what tools are they actually using? Because probably it is not really on the radar. And we spent a whole lot of time looking at places where retreat has gone miserably. And then the last thing in the space of incentivization in my 60-second answer would just be to say that the long term is really crucial, right? So if you elevate a home versus thinking about an entire region, the points of failure in terms of who holds the ball when disaster happens or when a market instrument no longer works will differ across those scales. It's all about those interactions that Monica unfolded so importantly in her presentation. And so in terms of the long term, we have to really grapple with the fact that the scale of the risks, the scale of interventions, including retreat, sometimes are mismatched, such that getting to incentivization is about internalizing some of these things that are going to affect someone at some point, even though right now it's easy to say, oh, that will be someone else, not me.
Well, that was a very compact way to answer a very loaded question. So thank you again to all the panelists. Again, please look at the chat. There's a link to the next session. I look forward to seeing you in other sessions for the remainder of the afternoon. Thanks again.